Prophetess, prisoner, or the last true voice of soul in an artificial age. The story of Amy Winehouse is not a simple rock and roll tragedy. It is a raw, unflinching blues song, a story of a talent so immense, so brutally authentic, it could only be born from a pain that was equally profound. To understand her, we must begin at the moment of her greatest, most paradoxical triumph, a moment that perfectly encapsulates the glorious and doomed nature of her entire existence. The 50th Annual Grammy Awards on February 10, 2008. But she is not in the glittering, cavernous Staples Center in Los Angeles. She is not walking the red carpet draped in jewels, basking in the adoration of her peers. She is 5,000 miles away, a world away, an exile from her own coronation. The night she was crowned Queen of Music, she wasn't even allowed in the kingdom. She is trapped in a small, hot, hastily arranged television studio in London, a consequence of her ongoing legal troubles and her inability to secure a U.S. visa in time, a decision that had come down just hours before the ceremony. The very success that should have placed her at the center of the musical universe has instead confined her to this gilded cage, a satellite link, her only fragile connection to the ceremony that is about to make her a legend. The air in the London studio is thick with tension. She emerges on the small makeshift stage, a fragile, defiant figure, a living contradiction. The iconic beehive hairdo is a towering, precarious crown, looking as though it could collapse at any moment. The Cleopatra thick eyeliner is both armor and war paint, a mask to hide the terror and exhaustion in her eyes. Her body, shockingly thin and covered in a chaotic tapestry of tattoos, pin-up girls, musical notes, her grandmother's name, is a roadmap of her turmoil, a diary written on her skin. She looks less like a pop star and more like a beautiful broken doll from a bygone era, a ghost haunting the machinery of a global television broadcast. Then the music starts. The familiar jaunty brass intro of Rehab kicks in, and a miraculous transformation occurs. The nervous, fidgety energy vanishes, replaced by a smoldering, almost insolent confidence. She leans into the microphone, and that voice, that impossible, once-in-a-generation voice, pours out of her. It is a sound that does not belong in the sterile digital landscape of the 21st century. It is a sound dredged up from the deepest, smokiest corners of a forgotten jazz club, a voice that contains the ghosts of Sarah Vaughan, Dinah Washington, and Billie Holiday. It is a voice of pure, unadulterated, intoxicating soul. She is not just singing. She is testifying, confessing, sneering at the very industry that is about to crown her. Later in the broadcast, the moment arrives. Tony Bennett, a living legend from the era she so worshipped, a voice her father had raised her on, announces the winner for Record of the Year. The camera is tight on her face in London. There is a slight, agonizing satellite delay. As her name is called, for a split second she doesn't react. There is a look of pure, blank confusion on her face, as if she cannot comprehend that this global, prestigious honor could possibly be for her. Her inner monologue is a silent scream of disbelief. They didn't say my name. They couldn't have. Not me. Not the mess. Not the girl from the tabloids. Then it dawns on her. Her eyes widen, her jaw drops, and she is overcome by a wave of genuine, unscripted, almost childish shock and joy. She turns and buries her face in the shoulder of her mother, Janice, a daughter seeking refuge. She looks to the heavens, a picture of ecstatic disbelief. It is the moment of her ultimate validation, a historic 5 Grammy win that cements her as the most vital and acclaimed artist on the planet. But look closer at that image of triumph. It is also a portrait of profound, shattering isolation. She is celebrating in a brightly lit box, an exhibit, while the real party, the real world of her peers, is happening an ocean away. The moment she reached the absolute pinnacle of her profession was the exact same moment her addictions and her demons had made her a captive. Her greatest victory was won in exile. This was a funeral in gold. This is the central, heartbreaking paradox of Amy Winehouse. Her art, which was a brutally honest confession of her life, brought her a level of fame that made living that life impossible. Her authenticity was not just her gift, it was her curse. And to understand the story of Amy Winehouse is to understand that the voice that captivated the world was also a scream. A desperate, beautiful, and ultimately futile attempt to sing the poison out of her own soul. The origin of that poison, the deep foundational wound that would inform every lyric she ever wrote and every self-destructive choice she ever made, can be traced back to the leafy, seemingly placid middle-class suburbs of Southgate, North London. She was born into a world saturated with music and defined by a profound emotional fracture. Her family was Jewish, loud, opinionated, and deeply enmeshed in the golden age of jazz and soul. Her father, Mitch Winehouse, a cab driver with a crooner's voice and a larger-than-life personality, would fill their home with the sounds of Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, and Ella Fitzgerald. Her mother, Janice, was a pharmacist, a quieter, more gentle soul. Music was not just entertainment in the Winehouse household. It was a language, a legacy, the very air they breathed. The true north of her musical and stylistic world, however, was her paternal grandmother, Cynthia, a glamorous, formidable figure who had once dated the legendary jazz saxophonist Ronnie Scott. Cynthia was Amy's idol, the embodiment of a kind of vintage, sophisticated glamour that seemed a world away from suburban London. She was a woman of impeccable style, with her own beehive hairdos and sharp suits, a woman of sharp wit and a deep, abiding love for the classic jazz vocalists. It was Cynthia who first recognized the true depth of Amy's prodigious raw talent, who understood that her granddaughter's preternaturally deep, soulful voice was not a childish affectation, but a rare and precious gift, a direct link to the legends she herself adored. But the loving, music-filled chaos of her early life was built on a crumbling foundation of emotional dishonesty. When Amy was just 9 years old, her father, Mitch, left her mother, Janice, for another woman. The departure was not a clean break, but a slow, messy, and confusing unraveling that left a permanent scar on Amy's young psyche. For a sensitive, fiercely intelligent child who worshipped her charismatic father, his absence, even if he remained in her life, created a cavernous void, a deep-seated terror of abandonment that would become the defining feature of her emotional landscape. She became the quintessential daddy's girl without a daddy consistently there, a dynamic that would lead her to spend the rest of her life seeking out and clinging to volatile, unavailable, often dangerous men, desperately trying to heal that original wound, often by recreating it over and over and over again. This early emotional turmoil was the fertile ground in which her demons would grow. The first and most insidious of these demons, the one that would haunt her and weaken her for the rest of her life, was not drugs or alcohol, but a secret she would carry with her always: bulimia. Around the age of 15, she and her friends learned about the diet of binging and purging. For her friends, it was a passing, foolish phase. For Amy, it became a lifelong, all-consuming addiction. The eating disorder was never about vanity, not really. It was about control. In a world where her emotional foundations had been shattered, where the love of her father felt conditional and unreliable. Controlling her body, her weight, her intake and output was the one form of power she had. It was the first weapon she turned upon herself, the beginning of a long and tragic war of self-destruction waged within the confines of her own skin, a secret way of purging the unbearable feelings she could not otherwise express. It was also during her teenage years that her rebellious spirit and her prodigious talent began to fully bloom. She was accepted into the prestigious Sylvia Young Theatre School, where she honed her craft but chafed under the structured showbiz kid environment. She was not interested in being a polished performer. She was interested in being a real artist. Her voice, even then, was a startling anomaly, a deep, world-weary, emotionally complex instrument that seemed to belong to a 40-year-old torch singer, not a North London teenager. It was a voice that was already soaked in a pain and a wisdom far beyond her years. The authenticity that would make her a star was already her defining characteristic. She was pathologically incapable of hiding her feelings, a trait that was both the source of her genius and the engine of her future suffering. The question that hangs over this formative period is a haunting one. Was her immense talent a gift that allowed her to transcend her pain, or was the pain itself the very source of her talent? A dark, bottomless well from which she drew her incredible and ultimately fatal artistry. The journey from precocious jazz-obsessed teenager to critically acclaimed recording artist was shockingly swift, a testament to the undeniable, raw, and almost frightening power of her talent. After being discovered by a talent scout, she was signed to a management deal and eventually a record contract with Island Records. The world got its first proper introduction to her artistry in 2003, with the release of her debut album, Frank. The title itself was a multifaceted declaration of intent, a nod to her ultimate hero, Frank Sinatra, but also a promise of the brutal, unflinching, almost pathological honesty that would become her trademark. This was not an album. It was a raw diary, the unfiltered, unvarnished confessions of a brilliant, wounded, and fiercely intelligent young woman. The album was a stunning and defiant statement in an era dominated by slick, manufactured pop and R&B. Frank was a throwback, a deeply personal and musically complex fusion of jazz, soul, and nascent hip-hop, a sound that was completely out of step with the times and therefore completely timeless. Imagine the recording sessions for this album. They were not held in a sleek corporate Los Angeles studio. They were gritty, intimate affairs in London. Picture a 19-year-old Amy, not as a pop starlet, but as a seasoned band leader. She stands in a small, dimly lit vocal booth, the air thick with cigarette smoke. Before her is not a top-of-the-line Neumann microphone, but a rusty, old, beat-up one that looks like it was pulled from a 1950s jazz club. In her hand, she holds a glass of cheap wine. This is her element. She is not just a singer. She is the writer, the composer, the emotional architect of the entire project. The lyrics, almost entirely written by Amy, were a revelation. They were witty, profane, deeply observational, and heartbreakingly vulnerable, showcasing a songwriter with a novelist's eye for detail and a poet's command of language. In songs like the scathingly hilarious Fuck Me Pumps, she dissects the vapid, label-chasing girls of London with the precision of a social anthropologist. In Stronger Than Me, she laments a useless, effeminate boyfriend, turning traditional gender roles on their head with a mixture of exasperation and genuine hurt. And in I Heard Love Is Blind, she tells a complex, darkly funny story of infidelity with a level of self-awareness and lyrical dexterity that was simply unheard of for an artist her age. The voice, of course, was the centerpiece, a deep, expressive, and technically dazzling instrument that could navigate the complex, winding melodies of jazz with an effortless, improvisational grace, then switch to a raw, emotional growl in the blink of an eye. It was a voice that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 heartbreaks, 1,000 smoky bars, 1,000 lonely nights. The album was a critical sensation in the UK, earning her nominations for the prestigious Mercury Music Prize and a coveted Ivor Novello Award for songwriting, a prize she cherished far more than any sales award. But even in this moment of initial triumph, the seeds of her lifelong conflict with the commercial music industry were sown. She was a purist, an artist who was pathologically incapable of being anything other than herself. She famously hated some of the final production choices on Frank, feeling that the label had added post-production gloss and pop-friendly beats that betrayed the raw, live, jazz-infused feel of her original demos. She was openly, often brutally, contemptuous of the promotional duties required of a new pop star. She refused to play the game. She wouldn't mime on television, calling it an insult to music. She was notoriously difficult in interviews, often answering questions with a surly, monosyllabic indifference if she found them to be stupid. She carried herself not with the polished, media-trained gratitude of a rising star, but with the uncompromising take-it-or-leave-it attitude of a seasoned jazz veteran who had paid her dues and earned the right to be difficult. For the music industry, which thrives on pliable, media-friendly personalities, she was a nightmare. For her growing legion of fans and the adoring critics, this very difficulty, this absolute refusal to compromise, was the source of her immense appeal. She was authentic in a world of artifice, a shot of raw, uncut truth in an ocean of diluted pop. This early period established the central tension of her career. She was an old-school, uncompromising artist trapped in the body of a modern, marketable pop star. The industry wanted to sell her image, the tattoos, the eyeliner, the attitude, but she was only interested in her art. It was a war she was destined to lose, a conflict that would only intensify as her fame grew to unimaginable and ultimately unbearable levels. Was her fierce, unyielding authenticity a sign of her artistic integrity, or was it a defense mechanism, a suit of armor she built around her profoundly vulnerable heart to keep a world she fundamentally distrusted at arm's length? If Frank was her raw diary, a brilliant, intimate glimpse into her soul, then her second album, 2006's Back to Black, was a full-blown public autopsy of her own heartbreak. The 5 years between the two albums were a period of immense change, artistic searching, and profound personal chaos. She had become a fixture in the gritty, vibrant, and notoriously hard-partying music scene of Camden Town in London. Camden in the mid-2000s was a character in itself, a chaotic, creative hub of pubs, live music venues, tattoo parlors, and a thriving, open drug culture. It was a place that both nurtured her creativity and voraciously enabled her self-destruction. And it was here, in the smoky haze of a local pub, that she met him. Blake Fielder Seville. He was not a musician, not an artist in her vein, but a music video assistant with a sharp vintage style, a silver tongue, and a pre-existing taste for hard drugs. Their connection was not a simple romance. It was a chemical explosion, a tornado of passion, addiction, and codependency that would consume them both and, in the process, produce one of the greatest albums of the 21st century. Their relationship was a tumultuous, on-again, off-again affair, fueled by alcohol and a shared love for the classic 60s girl group sound of the Ronettes and the Shangri-Las, music that perfectly captured their own brand of romantic teenage melodrama. He was, in a sense, the embodiment of the romantic doomed figures she had been singing about her whole life. The relationship was an addiction in itself, a cycle of intense highs and crushing lows. When Blake eventually left her to go back to a previous girlfriend, Amy was utterly, completely, and inconsolably devastated. The pain of this heartbreak, compounded by her lifelong, deep-seated fear of abandonment stretching back to her father's departure, became the raw material for her masterpiece. This is the ultimate, most tragic example of art as surgery. She did not just write songs about her heartbreak, she performed a public vivisection of her own soul, transforming her raw, agonizing, almost unbearable pain into a timeless, perfectly crafted work of art. The creation of Back to Black was a whirlwind of cathartic creativity, a process fueled by whiskey and sorrow. Imagine her in the kitchen of her small Camden flat, heartbroken, surrounded by empty bottles and overflowing ashtrays, the ghosts of her relationship haunting every room. She is scribbling lyrics on scraps of paper, the words pouring out of her not as a creative exercise, but as a desperate act of survival, the only way she knew how to process the immense pain that was threatening to drown her. She took this raw, bleeding emotion to producers Mark Ronson in New York and Salam Remy in Miami. The collaborations were magical. They channeled her old soul sensibilities and modern, raw lyrical honesty into a brilliant fusion of vintage 60s girl group pop, Stax-era soul, and a contemporary edge. Working with the Dap Kings, Ronson's band of master soul revivalists, they created a sound that was both a throwback and entirely new. The album's opening track and lead single, Rehab, was a defiant, witty, and brutally honest mission statement. It was a true story, a casual, defiant comment she had made to her management. "They tried to make me go to rehab, but I said no, no, no." Transformed into a global anthem of rebellion. The rest of the album was a journey through the 7 stages of grief and addiction. The desolate, mournful title track, Back to Black, was a perfect encapsulation of her grief, the lyrics a stunningly bleak admission of her own despair. "We only said goodbye with words. I died 100 times." She was performing an autopsy on her dead relationship, dissecting every moment of love and betrayal for the listener. From the angry, possessive defiance of "you know I'm no good" to the desperate, self-destructive plea of "love is a losing game," the album was a complete, unflinching, and perfect portrait of a woman on the edge. The global success of Back to Black was immediate and monumental. It was a critical and commercial sensation, transforming Amy from a respected UK artist into a global megastar. She had done it. She had taken her deepest, ugliest pain and spun it into gold, creating the undeniable masterpiece she had always known she was capable of. The world was now at her feet, but the success was a poisoned chalice. The album's triumph did not heal her. It only amplified her demons. And most tragically, it brought Blake back into her life. The very man whose absence had inspired the work was drawn back by the fame and fortune it generated. They were back together now with millions of dollars and the world's media watching their every move. A perfect, inescapable, and ultimately fatal storm. If the creation of Back to Black was the beautiful, tragic alchemy of turning pain into art, its aftermath was the horrifying, inevitable consequence of that success. The album's global triumph did not heal Amy. It only amplified her demons, giving them a bigger stage, a global audience, and a limitless budget. And most tragically, it brought Blake Fielder Civil back into her life. The very man whose absence had inspired the masterpiece was now back in her arms, and together they descended into a hell that was far deeper and darker than the simple, almost poetic heartbreak she had so beautifully chronicled. In May 2007, in a move that shocked and horrified her family, her friends, and her management team, they eloped to Miami and got married. This was not a romantic, celebratory union. It was a desperate, impulsive, and deeply pathological act of 2 addicts tying themselves to a sinking ship, believing their codependency was the purest form of love. For Amy, marrying Blake was the ultimate act of defiance against the world that was trying to save her from him. It was also the ultimate fulfillment of her deepest abandonment issues. By legally binding him to her, she thought she could finally stop him from ever leaving again. But their reunion marked a terrifying escalation in their shared self-destruction. It was during this period that Blake introduced Amy to the hardest, most destructive drugs: crack cocaine and heroin. This was not the rock and roll excess of her Camden party days. This was a profound and catastrophic escalation, a final terrifying leap into the abyss. Her inner monologue, one can imagine, was a twisted justification, a romanticization of their shared decay. This is real love. He's sharing his entire world with me, his own pain. This isn't just getting high. This is a sacrament. This is us against the world. No one understands our love. This is forever. She embraced his world completely, and in doing so, she began to lose her own. This descent into hard drug addiction coincided with the explosion of a new, particularly virulent form of celebrity media. The age of the 24/7, no-holds-barred digital paparazzi was dawning, and Amy Winehouse, with her undeniable talent, her iconic look, and her spectacular public unraveling, became their ultimate target. Her life in Camden became a war zone. This was not the glamorous, managed fame of A-list movie stars with their teams of publicists and bodyguards. This was a brutal, relentless, and dehumanizing siege. An army of photographers, often numbering in the dozens, camped outside her front door day and night. Their presence was a constant, suffocating reality. Imagine the psychological torment, waking up not to the sun but to the sound of aggressive, disembodied male voices shouting your name, of camera shutters clicking like a swarm of metallic insects. A sound that would trigger an immediate spike of adrenaline and fear. The simple act of walking to the corner store for a pack of cigarettes became a terrifying high-stakes gauntlet. The flash of the cameras was a constant, blinding strobe, a series of silent explosions that induced a state of perpetual anxiety and paranoia. The flashes were like flares shot at a prisoner, illuminating her cage, making it impossible to hide. The paparazzi were not just documenting her life, they were actively provoking it, shouting crude questions about her drug use, about Blake, taunting her, desperate for the money shot. The tearful breakdown, the angry outburst, the stumble, the collapse. She became an animal in a zoo, and the whole world was watching, clicking, and consuming. The iconic, heartbreaking images from this period tell the story of her complete collapse. There she is, wandering the streets of London late at night in just a bra and jeans, her face a mask of utter confusion and terror, looking lost and childlike. There she is again, after a reported violent fight with Blake, with her signature ballet slippers stained with her own blood, a smear of blood on her jeans, her expression one of profound, abject despair. There she is, looking skeletal, her skin covered in sores from impetigo, a ghost of the vibrant woman she once was. The media narrative, which had once celebrated her as an authentic genius, now gleefully and relentlessly branded her a train wreck, a crackhead, a disgrace. She was no longer a person. She was a product, a spectacle of decay to be consumed with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. The ugliest moment of this war came with the release of a video, secretly filmed by an acquaintance and sold for a fortune to a tabloid, that allegedly showed her smoking crack cocaine. It was a devastating betrayal. A final, brutal violation of her privacy that confirmed the public's worst fears. Her art, her music, was almost completely overshadowed by the grotesque theater of her addiction. The world was no longer listening to her songs, they were just watching her die. The tragic climax of her relationship with Blake came in 2008, when he was arrested and sentenced to prison for assault and obstruction of justice. The image of Amy wailing his name, "I love you, Blakey," as he was taken away by police was a portrait of absolute devastation. The anchor of her toxic world was gone. His imprisonment did not free her. It sent her further into a spiral of despair and obsession. He became a martyr, her lost love and her addiction, now without her partner in crime, became a solitary, more dangerous and more all-consuming affair. This was the ultimate catastrophic point of no return. The period following Blake's imprisonment was the central, most devastating paradox of Amy Winehouse's life. It was the moment of her greatest commercial and critical success, and her deepest, most profound personal misery. The world was handing her its highest honors, while her own life was in absolute, undeniable ruins. The 2008 Grammy Awards ceremony was the perfect tragic embodiment of this schism, a night that should have been her coronation but instead became a funeral in gold. She was the biggest, most acclaimed music star on the planet, but she was a prisoner, an exile from her own triumph. The pressure on her to perform that night via satellite was immense. The global media narrative was not about her talent, but about her addiction. The question was not, will she sing well, but will the train wreck show up? And she did. Her performance of You Know I'm No Good and Rehab was not just a flawless vocal delivery. It was a deeply ironic, defiant confession, a sneer at the very world that was judging her. She was a woman singing her prison songs from inside her cell, and the world gave her a standing ovation for it. The moment she won the Grammy for Record of the Year was a study in profound, heartbreaking confusion. Imagine her inner monologue in that split second of satellite delay. They're not going to say my name. They can't. They all hate me. They all think I'm a joke, a mess. This is all a dream. It's not real. Then, the dawning realization, the explosion of genuine, childish joy, immediately followed by a wave of something else, a hollow, overwhelming sadness. She was receiving the ultimate prize for an album about the all-consuming pain of her relationship with a man who was now sitting in a prison cell, a man who had helped lead her down this path of self-destruction. The award was not just for her art, it was for her pain. Her suffering had been validated as a commercially successful product, a golden statue awarded for the most beautiful suicide note ever written. In the aftermath of the Grammys, there was a concerted effort to save her. She attempted to escape the toxic fishbowl of Camden by spending an extended period on the Caribbean island of St. Lucia. For a while, it seemed to be working. The sun, the sea, the distance from the drug scene, it was a sanctuary. Photos from this period show her looking healthier, gaining some weight, a flicker of the old, vibrant girl returning to her eyes. She was writing music again. It was a glimmer of hope, but the escape was an illusion. The paparazzi, the machinery of her fame, eventually found her there. The long-lensed cameras appeared on the beaches, the reporters in the hotel lobbies. The idyll was shattered. This experience taught her a devastating lesson. There was no escape. Her fame was a prison without walls. She could run to the other side of the world, but her own myth and the vultures it attracted would always follow her. Compounding this sense of being trapped was the increasingly complex and controversial role of her father, Mitch. While he was undoubtedly trying to help his desperately ill daughter, his decision to participate in documentaries and even his own reality show about their family's struggle blurred the line between a concerned father and an opportunist. Amy, who still worshipped her daddy, was now seeing her most private, vulnerable moments of recovery and relapse being broadcast to the world, often with his participation. It was another form of betrayal, a confusion of love and exploitation that mirrored the way she felt about the music industry and the media. The very man whose line, "If my daddy thinks I'm fine," had become the hook of her biggest hit was now a central character in the public drama of her illness. The sanctuary of family had been breached, becoming just another part of the public spectacle. The transformation was complete. She was no longer a human being, but a piece of public property. Her tragedy a storyline to be produced and consumed. The final years of Amy Winehouse's life were a long, slow, and agonizing fade-out, a tragic coda to a symphony that had ended long before the music actually stopped. The period following the global triumph of Back to Black and the chaotic drama of her marriage to Blake was not one of creative resurgence, but of a deep and profound artistic paralysis. The world was waiting, with a mixture of eager anticipation and morbid curiosity, for a third album that would never come. The pressure to follow up a universally acclaimed Grammy-sweeping masterpiece like Back to Black was immense, almost insurmountable for any artist, let alone one as fragile as Amy. But the problem was not just a simple case of writer's block. It was existential. Her genius was inextricably, fatally linked to her pain. Her art, a direct, unfiltered translation of her life's turmoil. How could she possibly write a new chapter when she was still trapped in the same devastating one? Rereading the same tragic verses of heartbreak and addiction over and over again. Her trauma had become so all-consuming that it could no longer be processed into art. It was just raw, inarticulate, and paralyzing suffering. Her divorce from Blake Fielder Civil in 2009 was not a clean break, not a moment of liberating closure that could have inspired a new collection of songs. It was simply the official end to a relationship that would continue to haunt her, a ghost she could never fully exorcise. He was the muse for her greatest work, the central character in her tragedy, and without him, she was left creatively and emotionally adrift, a songwriter without her defining subject. This was a period of failed recording sessions, of brief, often erratic public appearances, and a growing, pervasive sense that the brilliant, once-in-a-generation songwriter was lost in the fog, unable to find her way back to the music. The public and the music industry, however, are not patient entities. They still demanded a performance, a return on their investment. This led to the final, catastrophic act of her professional career. A moment of public humiliation so complete and so heartbreaking that it served as the unofficial end of her life as an artist. In June 2011, she was booked to headline a music festival in Belgrade, Serbia, the start of a major European tour. It was meant to be her triumphant comeback, a declaration that she was back and ready to perform. Instead, it was her public execution. Imagine the scene. A massive outdoor stage, a crowd of 20,000 people who have waited for hours in the summer heat, their faces filled with love and anticipation. The band, a tight professional unit of seasoned musicians, takes the stage and the familiar, beloved horns kick in. But then Amy stumbles into the spotlight nearly an hour late. She is not the defiant, smoldering performer of the Grammys. She is a lost, disoriented child, her eyes vacant and confused, her body unsteady. She is profoundly, dangerously intoxicated, a ghost in the machine of her own show. What followed was not a concert, it was a complete psychological collapse on a world stage. For 90 agonizing minutes, she wandered the stage in a confused daze. She slurred her words, she mumbled incomprehensibly into the microphone. She forgot the lyrics to her own iconic soul-bearing songs, the very words she had ripped from her own heart. At times, she would stop singing altogether, turning her back on the audience to hug her band members, as if seeking reassurance from the only sane people in her immediate vicinity. Her band, a group of consummate professionals, played on heroically, trying to cover for her. Their faces a mask of pained embarrassment and deep sadness. The reaction from the crowd was a slow, agonizing crescendo of heartbreak and rage. The initial roar of adoring cheers slowly faded into a confused, humming silence as the audience, in unison, began to realize that something was terribly, terribly wrong. That silence then curdled into angry, impatient jeers and finally erupted into a deafening chorus of boos and whistles. The sound of 20,000 people, her fans, turning on her, their love transforming into open hostility, was the ultimate nightmare for any performer. In a heartbreakingly symbolic moment captured in slow motion in our collective memory, the black microphone, the very instrument of her genius, slipped from her limp hand, clattering onto the stage floor with a hollow final thud. It was over. In the days that followed, the footage went viral. The world watched in horror and pity. The rest of the tour was, of course, canceled. It was the final, undeniable proof that Amy Winehouse, the artist, the performer, could no longer function. The stage which had once been her sanctuary, the one place she was truly in control, had become the site of her ultimate humiliation. The final curtain fell not on a stage, but in the quiet, mundane solitude of her home in Camden Square, a place that had been both her creative hub and her personal prison. On July 23, 2011, just a few weeks after the Belgrade disaster, Amy Winehouse was found dead in her bed by her security guard. She was 27 years old. There was no dramatic overdose of illegal drugs, no suicide note, none of the lurid cliches of a rock and roll death. The cause of death was tragically simple, almost banal: alcohol poisoning. After a period of abstinence, a doctor's warning of live or die, she had relapsed and consumed a massive, lethal amount of vodka. It was not a party. It was a fatal final act of a relapsing addict, a body that had been pushed to its absolute limit for over a decade, finally, quietly giving up. The scene in her bedroom was a haunting, quiet tableau of her final, lonely battle. The empty vodka bottles surrounding her bed stood like a reverse candle vigil, not a memorial to her life, but a shrine to her final act of self-destruction. With her death, she became the newest and perhaps most tragic member of the 27 Club, the dark mythical pantheon of musical geniuses who had all been extinguished at the same young age. She joined the likes of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and Kurt Cobain, other brilliant, troubled artists who had burned too brightly, too quickly, and had been consumed by their own fire. The myth of the 27 Club is a potent one, a romanticization of the tortured artist archetype. And Amy fit the archetype perfectly. She was a woman who felt too much, who lived too hard, and who used her art to bleed out the pain that was killing her. Her entry into this club was her final, tragic coronation, immortalizing her not just as a musician but as an icon of beautiful, doomed youth. But her legacy is far more complex and profound than that simple, tragic myth. It is a legacy of two immortal masterpiece albums, Frank and Back to Black. Her music is timeless not just because of its soulful, vintage sound, but because of its brutal, unflinching honesty. In an age of manufactured pop and carefully curated images, Amy was pathologically, gloriously real. She never hid her flaws. She magnified them, studied them, and turned them into poetry. Her albums are not just collections of songs. They are confessional documents of a real, messy, funny, heartbreaking human life. And it is this authenticity that will make them live forever. But she also leaves behind another darker legacy. She is the ultimate cautionary tale of 21st century fame. She was a deeply unwell person battling profound mental health issues, a deadly eating disorder, and a crippling addiction, who was treated not as a patient but as a public spectacle. She was hunted and tormented by a predatory paparazzi culture that profited from her every stumble, a culture that the public, with its insatiable appetite for celebrity downfall, willingly fed. She was a canary in the coal mine of modern celebrity. Her death a stark and brutal warning of the human cost of our obsession. In the end, Amy Winehouse became the silenced prophetess of Camden, her life a warning that we were all too busy consuming to heed. She sang the truth until it killed her. The question is, were we listening or just waiting for the crash?